Hello, I'm Norm Marshall. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about taking the next step, highways to boulevards. This is the sixth presentation in a set of six. In the first two, I discuss why freeway capacity does not reduce congestion and 80 years of failure in reducing congestion by expanding freeways. So the question comes up, if expanding freeways does not reduce congestion, would removing freeways change congestion at all? And the evidence is that it does not. Many of the examples are unintentional because we don't often take down freeways, although there's a lot of movement to do more of that. But here are some examples. In New York City, the West Side Highway collapsed, and Sam Swartz, who later became chief engineer of New York City DOT and also was known as Gridlock Sam and still is, he was interviewed, and said one of my first assignments was racing out to the West Side Highway when it collapsed. We were hired to measure the impact on traffic. We didn't see any increase in traffic. The other avenues absorbed it, and we weren't able to trace it. Question: so a big highway disappears, and the traffic increase on other streets was barely measurable? Answer: yes. A highway carrying 80,000 vehicles a day collapsed, and nothing. We couldn't even measure a change in speeds. In a similar example in San Francisco, the Central Freeway had to be closed after earthquake damage. And before the closure, Caltrans warned drivers to stay as far away as possible because the agency predicted a traffic nightmare of the decade. But then these problems didn't emerge, and using ramp surveys and other studies, they could only account for about 20,000 of the 80,000 vehicles that normally use the freeway. We have a traffic phantom out there, Caltrans spokesman Jeff Weiss said. We don't know where everybody went. And after a lot of community debate going back and forth about whether to rebuild or remove, San Francisco finally ended up removing the Central Freeway and reconstructing this area as Octavia Boulevard, which is now has very, very valuable land use adjacent to it. Another freeway that San Francisco took down, the Embarcadero Freeway, had carried 70,000 vehicles a day on this double-decker thing, which was blocking the view of the ferry terminal. And now you see the ferry terminal without the freeway in front. This is now one of the top tourist attractions areas in the world. In the third and fourth presentations, I describe why bad modeling shows false benefits to freeway expansion. It also shows false impacts to freeway removals. In general, these studies start out, they never get much beyond the idea that the road has 80,000 vehicles today, and if you don't build a road that carries 80,000 vehicles, it's a failure. And obviously that's not true, as seen in the historical examples. In the fourth presentation, I describe how better modeling gives better answers, both for freeway expansion, and now I will show an example of how it gives good answers for freeway removal. I'm going to return to a case study in Little Rock that I used earlier in this series. We're looking at a map here of a trip in the morning peak hour starting in North Little Rock at the transit provider headquarters and ending in Little Rock in the lower right at the Clinton Library. And with triple convergence, both the street route and the freeway route take 8 minutes. The freeway route being I-30 on the east and the quickest street route being Main Street in the center. And as I discussed when I presented this earlier, the same travel time is reached by congestion on the freeway route in the areas marked in red. That's how we get the same travel time, even though I-30 has a much higher posted speed limit. Because there is congestion on I-30, the Arkansas Highway Department wants to expand I-30 from 6 lanes to 12 lanes, and this is a rendering of the bridge that they're planned. They like to not call this a 12-lane bridge because they call the outer barrels collector distribution lanes, but it sure looks like a 12-lane bridge. This study is myopic. The study area that they're look at is shown in the green area there, surrounded by green, and you see it's just some of the interstate highway system and a short buffer around that. And this doesn't account for diversion between bridges, which is a key issue here in any sort of bridge expansion study. It does not account for the impacts of induced travel outside this narrow study area. The study area, they're widening everything, so of course that works, but what happens with the traffic that upstream and downstream of that? And it doesn't consider impacts on downtown Little Rock outside the study area. What would happen if they were to do this, it would funnel more traffic onto a very small number of ramps downtown and would be like a fire hose shooting traffic and in a way that really can't be mitigated well. If we look at the whole region, which we should be when we're thinking about bridge capacity across the Arkansas River, there's the 3 bridges downtown that we saw in the earlier map, but there's also 2 beltway bridges, one to the east and one to the west. So there's actually already 3 interstate highways with 6 lanes each crossing the Arkansas River. It's an amazing amount of freeway capacity for a relatively small urbanized area. So in addition to the no build and build alternatives, which are being studied by the state, we've also studied a boulevard alternative. And that alternative, we do 2 things. One is we convert I-30 from the 6-lane interstate highway to a 6-lane street, a boulevard. And we also add a new 4-lane bridge to the west so that there would actually be 4 street bridges downtown. And this wouldn't be 100% necessary, but it serves 2 important purposes in the discussion. One is that this is a project that's been desired anyway to provide better connectivity to the west side of downtown, where there's a lot of underutilized and vacant property. And the other is that it would make up for whatever loss of capacity people were worried about. People seem to be very worried that somehow this will kill downtown Little Rock if we don't have that interstate bridge there. So when we do our good modeling, what's called the DTA model, we find interesting pattern, and we look at it regionally, we find interesting patterns of how the peak period crossings are changed across alternatives. So this is the morning peak hour southbound, which is the peak in that period. And if we don't do anything, the no build, what happens is traffic does grow, the bridge crossings grow, but much of the growth is in the 2 beltway bridges. In particular, I-30 wouldn't increase traffic because it's already congested. So the extra traffic growth is going to the beltway bridges where there's still some capacity. And also, of course, a lot of the development is somewhat outside the center of the region anyway, so the beltway bridges aren't really that circuitous for much of that traffic. If we do the expansion, the 12-lane, instead of getting the growth on the beltway bridges, we get the growth on I-30, the light blue. And then in the boulevard alternative, we add a new section for Chester, but it's more like the no build, except that the traffic that had been on I-30 now splits between Chester and I-30. But we can accommodate significant growth in traffic. And the PM peak hour shows the same general issue, same general pattern. This is northbound in this case. If we look at regional performance, we see not very much change from the current conditions with good modeling. In general, we actually have slightly less vehicle miles traveled per person per day and slightly less vehicle minutes per person per day because a fair amount of the growth that's forecast for Little Rock is infill. And between the future alternatives, there's very little difference, but the one that is worse is actually the freeway expansion. That has the most vehicle miles traveled, and since it's really not improving regional speeds, It also has the most vehicle minutes per person per day. All we're really accomplishing is having people travel the same speed and a longer distance. The Boulevard plus Chester Street alternative works fine, but doesn't offer a huge advantage over the no build. Good modeling will show that many highway to boulevards projects are feasible. And for more information about highways to boulevards, the Congress for the New Urbanism has a good project at this website. I'm Norm Marshall. Thank you for watching and listening.